There was an interview with President Trump on Fox News yesterday morning, and he was asked, hey, are you expecting a recession this year? And he basically did not say no, is the short of it. His quote is, I hate to predict things like that. There's a period of transition because what we're doing is very big. And so I think that, look, I think it's actually a pretty fair statement by him in that, hey, the Trump administration is trying to effectively overhaul the U.S. economy in a really substantial way. And what's going to determine whether or not they're successful, in my opinion, is not whether or not the economy slows down in the short term. I think it's probably going to, and I'll get into my reasons why for that in a bit. But rather, the two questions that you need to ask, how deep does that slowdown get? And then how quick is the economic growth on the back end of it? And those are going to be the things that ultimately determine whether or not they are successful at this.
So, Chuck, I mean, I found it incredibly telling because it is, to your point, I think both an accurate and honest assessment of the economy. And to some degree, you wish politicians would be this honest more frequently, right? Like, I think about the last few years of messaging from the Biden White House on the state of the economy and basically getting out there and disregarding, I think, a lot of the polling that Americans were stating about their feelings on the economy and inflation and pricing, and that did not go terribly well. That having been said, I don't know a lot. I can't think of, for instance, in my adult memory, a president coming out there being asked about weakness in the economy and not trying to spin the question. Right, not trying to say, right, hey, yeah, we might be facing some form of downturn, but I have confidence that tax cuts, or if it gets that way, the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates, or I will put pressure on Congress to pass a stimulus bill or lower taxes, or do any of those things that you would expect an administration to respond to an economic downturn with. Instead saying, yeah, I'm not really sure, and we kind of anticipated this sort of turmoil to get where we're going. It is very honest. But very surprising to hear from a sitting president.
And so let's enter some facts into evidence. I'll put on my lawyer hat, which I generally try not to wear because, well, I'm not a lawyer, but I like the way they build arguments. And so that's what I'm going to do here. Let's enter a couple things into evidence. First, the reason that companies and large portions of the United States have enjoyed and benefited from globalization is because of lower costs.
Yes. Go look at the price of a TV 30 years from now compared to today, and we don't need to explain a lot more. But that has played out everywhere across food supply chains and every other area out there.
The reason that companies send their production elsewhere is because it's cheaper for them to do so, and that allows them to do two things. Number one, expand their margins. Number two, sell those goods more cheaply then. So that is first and foremost what you see. So number one, if you're talking about bringing production back into the United States, ultimately it is an absolute certainty. An absolute certainty. And Mike, I'm not certain of too much in life. Maybe a few things on a daily basis. That's about it. It is an absolute certainty that if you are bringing production back to the United States that you had previously offshored, it's going to be more expensive. Because otherwise you wouldn't have offshored it.
Agreed.
It's easier to make stuff here and not have to deal with logistics and potential currencies and this. It's the reason that you do it is because it's cheaper. So,
and by the way, no one in this administration is denying that. Scott Bessent just last week acknowledged.
You can't deny it because it would be fundamentally unserious.
Scott Bessent last week acknowledged that, hey, the American dream is not built on the idea of being able to buy cheap goods. That was specifically speaking to the fact that, yeah, if you try and manufacture a bunch of stuff in the United States, no matter where you were doing it previously, it'll be more expensive to do it just here.
Part number two, when you're talking about imposing tariffs, whether it is on China, Canada, Mexico, the European Union, whoever it might be, that is raising costs as well.
Sure.
Hard stop.
Yep. Whether borne entirely by the consumer, in part by the consumer, in part by the manufacturer or importer, up for debate, but higher prices, yes.
Number three, if you are talking about widespread deportations of people that are not legal immigrants in the United States, you are reducing the labor force. in the United States because the vast majority of those people are working. They are often working under the table in jobs where they can be paid, in cash and things like that, and oftentimes in jobs that a lot of Americans probably wouldn't do for the wages that are available. And that is something where you're talking about, again, if you look at where GDP growth comes from, it's a function of two things. How many hours does the population work? And how productive are they during those hours? If you're reducing the labor force, you are reducing the number of hours worked. As such, it's going to be a drag on growth. Now, ultimately, what you are trying to get to if you are President Trump and his team is something where you say, look, I want to resolve these imbalances so that the average American can have a better platform for growth for the long run. So the fourth piece that I'll enter into evidence is kind of one of these long-run things that's out there, which is the United States is running 7% annual deficits at a time when unemployment is 4%. That is not sustainable. That can be more up for debate because there's really there's no like hard and fast rule when it comes to exactly what level of debt or deficit, annually or in totality is sustainable or not.
And to be fair, like every previous understanding of what was sustainable has been stretched and just expanded, right? If you had told somebody
Totally.
where deficits would have gotten to back in the 1970s, by the 1990s, they would have told you that it's completely unsustainable. And likewise, if you told somebody from the 90s where we'd be by 2020, they would say that's crazy.
But we're in unprecedented territory right now. Like
agreed.
It's like
completely agreed.
Like everything's sustainable until it's not. And one of the lessons that, and this comes from NASA, when the Challenger space shuttle exploded. The reason why, yes, it was a failure in an O-ring, but the reason why was that they launched the thing with temperatures way too cold. And the reason why they did that is because they had kind of kept moving the goalposts and they saw no problems, and so they said, okay, maybe we can go a little bit further, and eventually they couldn't. And so it was one of those situations where everything was fine until it very much was not. When you look at deficits, again, there's been this, okay, we can stretch it a little further, we can stretch it further, but eventually you get to a point where you're like, no, you really can't. So where that point is, we don't know until we get there. And so ultimately, if the federal government is saying, hey, we want to reduce government spending, that is going to be government spending, whether you think it's efficient or inefficient, it is going into the economy and producing demand. If you reduce that demand and suck it out of the economy, it's tough to say that is going to help growth. So you got four key areas where you're sitting there and you're saying, these are things that potentially raise prices and slow demand in the short term. Which brings us to, again, those $2 trillion questions, which are, hey, can you slow demand in a way where it doesn't get so bad that you have a recession? Because quite honestly, I think a lot of us have forgotten how bad recessions are. We haven't had a real one in 17 years now.
Yep.
The 2021 was induced by our behavior from kind of the top down, and ultimately was resolved pretty quickly. The last real recession we had was 16, 17 years ago, so we haven't gone through one in very long. In a long time actually, and it's something where, hey, can you avoid it, or at least if you do experience one, can it be relatively short and shallow? And the second piece there is then, okay, how do you grow on the back end of that recession or slowdown? What do you do on that front? So I think this is the bet that the Trump administration is making. I have no idea if they're going to be successful or not. They may not. I'm not going to preemptively punish them for something that hasn't happened yet. I'm not going to be the boy who cried recession. If it does happen, okay, like, how are you going to actually deal with it, and how do you get out of it, and how do you manage your way through, and what do you look like on the back end of that is going to be the question. But we're not there yet, and that's something that I keep coming back to because I am a follower of the data. There's things out there that's concerning, but you have to see how it develops because you just don't know, and we've seen plenty of these instances the last few years where everyone wanted to cry recession, and it never happened. And I'm not going to cry recession if we don't see the data suggesting it.